Of how my husband ran away with his brother's wife on their wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I've said it on Instagram. I noticed my husband was acting really strange before the wedding. He started going out every single night. He wouldn't tell me where he would go and he would leave his phone in the house. Sometimes he'd come back the following morning. A few days before the wedding, I decided to confront him about it. I knew that I didn't want to stress him out before the wedding, but at the same time, I couldn't live like this. I had this worried, sick feeling in my stomach every single night and I would barely sleep knowing that he was out doing God knows what. When I asked him what was going on, he told me that I was overreacting and that he was just playing poker with his friends at his friend's house. I told him to call his friend on speaker so that he could confirm his story. That's when he threw a tantrum. He started slamming doors and cabinets in the kitchen, telling me that I was overreacting and that I needed to let him live his life. And he even mentioned divorce for the first time ever. He said he didn't want to be tied down to such a jealous woman. That's when I broke. I literally pulled out a list of all the women that he had cheated on me, the ones that I knew of. And I told him that he had broken my heart over 10 times that I knew of. And that I knew he would never stop and that the only thing that was fair for me was to at least have him be honest. That's when he hugged me and started to cry. And that was the first time I had seen him show any emotion towards my pain. He began to apologize and told me that he never meant to hurt me that way. We hugged and we just watched a movie and everything was back to normal. But I knew that nothing was back to normal and that he was hiding something. Finally, the day of the wedding comes and he is stressed. From the moment he woke up, he was pacing in the house, sweating. He even had 4 cups of coffee. I asked him what was wrong and he said that he was just nervous for his brother. We finally head to the church where everyone is already waiting. And when we get there, the first thing I see is the bride. She's standing outside the church with the suitcase. Without even turning to look at me, my husband tells me to get out of the car quickly. Part 3 is up. Part 3 of how my husband ran away with his brother's wife on their wedding day. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I've said it on Instagram. Without looking at me, my husband tells me to get out of the car as fast as I can. I asked him what was going on and he opened the door and pushed me out. That's when the bride jumps into the car with her suitcase and her wedding dress. And he drove off as fast as he could. I kept yelling at the top of my lungs. Of course, the entire family runs out of the church to see what's happening. That's when my mother-in-law told me that the wedding had already happened, but we had arrived late. And that right after they were married, the bride took the groom aside and told her that she didn't want to be with him. Of course, he got really upset and they got into a full blown-out fight in front of everyone. When he asked her where she was going, she said she had a ride prepared. She grabbed her suitcase and apparently walked out, and that's when my husband and I pulled up. The groom and I were absolutely devastated. I kept calling my husband and he kept calling his wife. But of course, they both ignored us. My parents-in-law were so upset that they even called the police to report his car stolen. This was in the hopes that they would at least find their car. But unfortunately, nobody found the car on the streets. This led us to believe that they were probably hauled up at some hotel. This is when I remembered that my husband really liked this one hotel that was by his job. He always told me that he would go there for drinks with his friends. So my family-in-law and I show up. And as soon as we get to the hotel, I see my husband and his now girlfriend having lunch in the restaurant at the hotel. Of course, we confronted them. We were all yelling at the top of our lungs and the hotel kicked us out. Finally, my father-in-law was able to talk some sense into my husband and make him realize what he had done. Not only had he ruined our marriage, but his brother's future as well. His brother was beside himself, so depressed and kept crying. And my mother-in-law had to take a sedative in order to calm down. My husband came to his senses and told his girlfriend that what they did was wrong. He looked at me and begged me for forgiveness, but of course, I didn't speak a word to him. My now sister-in-law / my husband's girlfriend, she decided to head straight to the airport and went back to her parents. It's been a few weeks now and my brother-in-law took her back. I still haven't forgiven my husband, but we're still living in the same house. I don't know what to do. Story time about how I broke the news to my very religious family that I was single and pregnant. Disclaimer, this is not my story time. I sent me on Instagram. My parents are very religious and super strict. I was never allowed to have boyfriends or even talk to boys or even have guy friends. My girlfriends only could come over to my house and I could never go over to friends' houses. I was never even allowed to go to parties. Anytime I needed to make a phone call, my parents would monitor the phone call. So there was absolutely no way I could get away with anything. And I never even lied to them. I got straight A's and graduated valedictorian from my high school. When I turned 18, I went to the university my parents wanted me to go to. My parents are very rich and have lots of money. So I knew that they would get me into whatever university they wanted me to go to. When I finally got accepted into university, I begged them to let me stay on campus, even though we're only a 2-hour drive away from the university. I wanted to have privacy. And of course, I wanted to feel like a grown-up. After months and months of convincing my parents, they finally said yes. They even got me a private dorm so that I wouldn't have to share my room with anyone. For the first time in my life, I had independence and I could make my own decisions. But still, all in all, I was a pretty good girl. I would go to class, go study at the library, and then go back to my dorm. I never went to any parties, but I did start making friends. One of these friends was a really wild girl. She was in my dorm building and she pretty much did everything I ever wanted to do. She was wild and crazy and I just wanted to be like her. She started inviting me to all these house parties and I didn't know how to say no. I went to one of them and I met this really cool guy. At least I thought he was cool at the time. We spoke all night and he tried to make me believe that he was this perfect little boy, and of course, I fell for it. After hanging out a few more times, we did the dirty, and then he ghosted me. This was the first time I had done anything like that, and I was really heartbroken. I was convinced that this guy was gonna marry me. That's how naive I was. After the last time I'd seen him, I realized that I hadn't gotten my period, and when I checked my calendar, it had been 2 months since I got my last period. Now you may ask why I didn't notice this before. Pretty much because I was studying all the time. I never really gave myself any breaks and I was constantly reading books and doing homework. I basically lived in my books. When the realization of not having my period for 2 months came in, I was devastated and I knew that I was pregnant. I ran to the nearest drugstore and got a test. When I saw that it was positive, the first thing I did was call the boy. But like I said, he had ghosted me. But this time he did answer the phone because it had been a few months. I told him that the test was positive. He told me the baby wasn't his and then he hung up. Unfortunately for me, I had no idea where he lived. I decided to Google his name and apparently he didn't even go to the university that I was going to. He was just a friend of some guy that went there. Finally, Christmas break arrives. I was 4 weeks pregnant and I showed up to my parents' house. Part 2 is up. Part 2 of how I broke the news to my very religious parents that I was single and pregnant. Disclaimers is not my story time, I was sending me on Instagram. I was 4 weeks pregnant, the guy that got me pregnant had ghosted me, and I knew I had to go home for Christmas from university. I had thought of how I was going to tell my parents and I even wrote them a letter. I was simply going to hand my parents the letter as soon as I got home. But when I got there, they were so happy to see me. I hadn't been home for a few months and I could tell that they really missed me and I just didn't want to spoil the moment. So instead of telling them the first day, I waited until the second day. I came out from my bedroom and my mom asked me why I looked so pale. This is when I just said it. I'm pregnant. My mom instantly began to cry and asked me what happened. I could hear my dad coming down from the stairs. I turned around and said to him, I'm pregnant. When my dad saw my mom crying, he sat down on the couch and said nothing. And this was scarier than him yelling at me. My mom joined him on the couch and then I sat on the floor right next to them. That's when I just decided to tell them the truth. From beginning to end, I told them exactly what happened. Then my dad said, don't worry, we will help you. I could not believe it. And as soon as my dad said that, my mom stopped crying and said, yeah, he's right. We're your family and you don't need that guy. The only thing my dad asked from me was to stay in university. And I told him that there was no way I was going to let my education go to waste. I could tell my parents were really disappointed in me, but they didn't say anything. We had all our family coming over for Christmas dinner, and my dad announced it to everyone then. Instead of acting the way I thought he was going to act, he was almost happy. He wasn't angry, but he was disappointed, but he didn't hide it like a little dirty secret. My family congratulated me, and they were all very happy. But of course, they started asking all these questions. When I told them that the father wouldn't be involved, they were really upset. Luckily, my aunt was dating a private investigator at the time. I gave her the baby daddy's number and name, and she gave it to her boyfriend. He came back with a bunch of information for me. Apparently, he was a dropout and didn't have a job, but he came from a very wealthy family. So my parents and I decided to get a lawyer and ask for child support. When I had the baby, my family was so happy. He is literally the light of our lives. He is so loved by his grandparents, and I'm so grateful to my parents. We all live together, and my baby is 5 years old now. His grandpa and him are best friends, and they do everything together. Now, the baby daddy wants to be in my child's life, but I don't know if I should say yes or no. Up until last year, he didn't want anything to do with us. But now that he sees that the baby is older and he plays, he wants to be involved now. I don't know if I should say yes, but I also feel bad depriving my child of his father. Merry Christmas, and what should I do?